To all of you, and we're now going to look at the directive Parliament Council on the acquisition of firearms weapons. We've reached the amendments, first discussion. 847 amendments have been tabled in our committee, and then of course there will be those from the Libe committee. We're still awaiting those. But today is an opportunity for an initial discussion on the amendments. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to the rapporteur on this dossier, Vicky Ford, our chairman.
Thank you very much, and thank you for setting aside time again and taking over the chair so that I can listen carefully to what others have say. Thank you, colleagues, for the huge amount of interest that's been shown in this file. As you say, about 850 amendments. This has been a very interesting reading experience for myself. Unfortunately, we only got the English translation of all of the different amendments in the past couple of working days, and I wanted to make sure we could look at all of the different amendments. A lot of colleagues have very helpfully tabled variations on my original suggestions, so that I think is helping us to move towards a consensus. There were a few areas where in my own round amendments I made some additional suggestions, in particular on marking, where it became clear in discussions that in some cases it's just not technically possible to mark every single essential component in the same manner just because of the size and the nature of the mark. So there's still a bit more work to be done on that. On data exchange, now clearly we need data exchange to be workable from the very bottom up. So when a dealer sells a firearm, they need to be able to notify the national authorities. The national authorities then need to be sharing information with each other. I think we're moving towards a workable solution there. There's some more work we need to do with the Libe committee. On the deactivation regulation, the more I hear from citizens about the confusion that's being caused by the DEAC regulation at the moment, the more I am aware that that was a rush proposal which has got some serious flaws, and as a result of that I've proposed bringing the entire DEAC regulation into this document as an annex at this stage, and that is to ensure that we keep the Commission and the Member States fully focused on the need to rework the DEAC regulation and make sure it actually works, because there's some serious concerns about what they passed in November. And I also put some amendments in about the permanent conversions. So in Annex A6, well, we talk about semi-automatics converted to automatics. I'd table some word about that needed to be a permanent conversion. Those were the main amendments I put in the second round. Thank you to people who co-signed them. In terms of a voting list, we had a meeting with members and shadows last night. I'm keen to try and have as transparent and democratic a process towards this as possible, so that members will get a chance to vote on as many of the different amendments as possible, that we don't wrap them all up into a compromise, but actually we bring them in clusters to the whole of this committee, and bringing in some of the amendments from the Libe committee too, so that we will have a set of different options, package one, and then if package one falls, we'll move on to package two, and we'll vote these in smaller blocks, not massive compromises. I think that that is a more complicated arrangement than we would often do, but I think it gives it democratic transparency, and it allows us to then start a discussion with the Member States and the Council, knowing more clearly what the views of the Parliament were. So given all of that, given that we've just started to work on the first drafts of the compromises, but only from the end of last week when we had the translations, given the number of amendments and complexities, I intend to ask the coordinators this evening if we will delay the vote on this into July to give us a bit more time to make sure that we get those compromises right, so that everybody will be able to see them and to have a very transparent approach in the voting list here. Thank you.
Bene, grazie davvero al Presidente.
Thank you very much to Rapporteur. So can we now take the first round of comments from shadows? Some are here, EPP. Bill is not. Andreas, perhaps.
Presidente, as you said, I'm asked by our shadow rapporteur, Anna Corazza-Bildt, to present shortly the point of view that she, on behalf of the EPP, wants to give on the presentation that Vicky gave. Zunächst mal, glaube ich, ist wichtig, deutlich.
First of all, I think it's important to make it clear that we are very grateful to the rapporteur for her positive approach to this file. We think we have made it clear where the compromises might lie. On the one hand, we have to respect the justifiable concerns of sportsmen and hunters, but of course, on the other hand, we need to ensure greater safety and security with regard to circulation of weapons. So Ms. Ford's proposal to postpone the vote until July should not prevent us from doing everything we can, the Shadow Rapporteur doing everything she can to contribute to this being dealt with quickly. There are a few areas where Ms. Corazza-Bildt has detailed proposals, and I'm going to read them out in English because she's given me her instructions in English.
Part of proposed proposed changes by herself concerns, first of all, the essential components and marking. Traceability, from her point of view, must be ensured, but the EPP can agree to mark essential components if this is feasible. We must ensure traceability, but at the same time in a pragmatic approach. And I think that goes quite in the same line as Vicky has already said. Secondly, on modification, it's important that owners can do minor modifications themselves without having to be a registered dealer. If changes do lead to a change in category of the firearm, for sure, we are ready then also to go for modification. The third point concerns the collectors or the museums. From the point of view of Anna, it should be possible for member states to choose to authorize persons dedicated to the gathering, study and conservation of firearms to possess firearms classified in category A, provided that necessary measures for safe storage has been taken. The fourth point is a very critical one, Mr. President. This is the question of medical checks. Article 5, paragraph 2. We believe that it is important to make sure that only people physically and mentally fit to possess a weapon can do it. In Europe, we have many different systems for this, and it is important that the checks can be designed by member states. And I think by designing this process to member states, we can avoid a lot of problems that may exist with the proposal of the European Commission. The pre-final point is the distance sales. Article 6, where Ms. Corazza-Bildt proposes that the ban on trade over the internet, telephone, email through ads in magazine is simply too much, and therefore she thinks that this makes it difficult for people in rural areas. From her point of view, it should be important that member states can make sure that transactions take place under conditions that allow verification of identity and of the right to engage in such a transaction. Then there are some points on limited licenses on categories of firearms, but I think we are already quite close to what Vicky has presented, not in this meeting, but in the last meeting. So to conclude, I should say that the proposed changes would strengthen the parts of the proposal that could contribute to combat and prevent crime. And at the same time, we reject changes in the directive that only add burden and restrict freedom without any added value, and therefore we hope that the compromises that Vicky will present to us can fix this all and bring us to a very smooth vote. Thank you so much, Mr. President.
Grazie all'onorevole Schwab.
Thank you, Mr. Schwab. And the S&D rapporteur is also absent, but I know we have someone to represent.
Dankeschön.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Nicola. Thank you to Mr. Cofferati, who has invested an enormous amount of effort in this, but unfortunately he is prevented from attending the meeting today and has asked me to represent him. Therefore, I too, as coordinator for the S&D, will accept the proposal to postpone this, as this is such a sensitive file. And I think our decision on this has to be very carefully prepared. Therefore, we will be able to agree as well to that proposal to postpone. Mr. Cofferati has noted down some points for me on the most important aspects of this proposal for us in the S&D. First of all, the marking of essential components. It is very important that we ensure traceability. Therefore, the essential components, not just individual components, need to be correspondingly marked. As regards the signal and alarm weapons, salute weapons, they should remain in the corresponding categories. In other words, the categories that they belonged to before they were changed. But for the alarm and signal weapons, they ought to be put in category C after they have been changed. And then the question of the health checks. This is a very controversial issue. We've discussed it here in this committee as well. And our group feels that before someone acquires the right to use a weapon, they certainly should have a fitness or a health check. Of course, member states' individual health systems and rules for this vary enormously, and I think it should be left up to the member states' authorities to decide whether there should be continuous monitoring or not of the suitability of the person health-wise. That should be left up to the member state according to their own cultures and traditions. As regards museums and collectors, there I think we have a lot of flexibility on museums because of the cultural and historic aspects that are bound up with this, and the possibility of ensuring that the necessary safety measures are taken. But that doesn't apply to collectors. We don't have a uniform definition of what a collector is in the EU, and therefore we want to treat collectors just like any other person that couldn't be described as a collector. And on distance sales, we support what the Commission has proposed. That is that distance sales of weapons can only be done through registered dealers and traders. We're more flexible when it comes to ammunition. The sale of weapons doesn't happen as frequently as the sale of ammunition. Sportsmen and hunters regularly make such purchases, and therefore we need to have a differentiated approach. And we ask member states to establish rules for the safe storage of weapons and ammunition, and above all to ensure that weapons and ammunition are kept separately from one another to reduce the danger that unauthorized persons can actually use them. That's a very important point for us. As regards categories A6 and A7, this is one of the most important points. We're in favour of category 6, including automatic firearms which have been converted into semi-automatic firearms. because it might be possible for this type of weapon to be converted back into a fully automatic weapon. For that reason, we should classify those weapons in A6 or leave them in A6. As regards category A7, there we propose that we shouldn't judge the weapons on the basis of dangerousness as the Commission does, but on the basis of technical aspects that would correspond to potential danger. And we should combine those technical aspects with other proposals that have been made, in particular exceptions for national defence and security. I'm thinking of the Finnish problem here that we need to address. Or for sports shooting organisations. Sorry, I'm mixing up my languages here. And we also propose transition periods or transitional solutions for everything concerning transposition and implementation for A6 and A7. So we think we should leave enough time for these changes to be made so that you don't find sportsmen finding themselves in a legal position overnight just because they haven't had time to apply for the right authorization. That's a very important point. And finally, can I state, as the Commission regularly says, we are not trying to annoy sportsmen or hunters. We're not trying to get at their weapons, their firearms. They are in other categories that we are not changing. It's a question of addressing the really dangerous weapons that might be in circulation. Once again, Kalashnikovs, but they're not the only ones. You know, military weapons ought not to fall into the wrong hands, because those are the most dangerous weapons, and those are the ones we're trying to deal with. Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole.
Thank you, Mrs. Gephardt. And for ALDE, Dita Charanzova, please.
Thank you, Chair. And first of all, I would like to thank Madam Rapporteur for her hard work on this file, for a very transparent process, and also the fact that she has managed to take on board the comments and views of all stakeholders that will be at the end affected by this new legislation. I think we are entering quite an important stage of preparation of Parliament's position on this highly important file. I think the number of amendments tabled on this report shows how sensitive this issue is, and that the Commission's proposal was far from being acceptable to most of us. While reading the amendments, I was very happy to see how consensual the majority of the political groups are on the key points of the proposal. Together with a very encouraging result of the votes in LIBE committee, I think the amendments clearly demonstrate in what direction we all wish to see this file to go. And I hope that our colleagues both in the Commission but also in the Council understand better now what our priorities are. Generally speaking, I have to say I can support many of the amendments tabled, and I hope that they provide a good basis for future broad compromise on the final report. This means, for instance, that any proposals on possible recategorization of semi-automatic weapons should be rather limited, with complete deletion of the proposed A7 category, which would ban semi-automatic weapons which resemble to automatic ones. For those semi-automatic weapons that were converted from automatic ones, which the Commission proposed to ban initially, we have several proposals on the table now, and I'm quite sure we can find a a good compromise on this one as well. So in any case, I think it will be challenging now to table the compromise amendments, but I'm looking forward to further cooperation both with the rapporteur and other shadows on this file. Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole.
Thank you, Mrs. Chancellor. Now, I don't see anyone from GUE. There's no shadow rapporteur, so I give the floor now to Mr. Duran for the Greens. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Vicky. I perhaps repeat myself, but thank you for the work. And of course, we do need to give ourselves time, so I'm happy to postpone to July, right from day one. You know, this was a sensitive subject, but little by little we're getting down to the essentials, making people's lives in Europe safer. People who have nothing whatsoever to do with terrorism, murder, etc. So yes, let's give ourselves time. I'm pleased, little by little, to see that we're trying to give the text content which is consensual and pragmatic. Now, on the categories, A7, as I said right from the start, and here I agree with what Evelyn said on behalf of Sergio Coverati, the resemblance of arms, well, that's legally not tight. It's poor. You can't talk about weapons that look like others. But we shouldn't get rid of the category. We just need to put something into it that is have objective criteria. For example, we propose that rifles that can be transformed with perhaps triggers, you know, there are all sorts of details one could suggest, but I'm sure we can find compromises. Now, I won't return to what Evelyn said about museums, collection museums. We agree. It's important to identify an exemption for museums. But, of course, where you have collectors that don't offer the same guarantees, well, no. And then exchange of information on IT exchange platforms. Well, we've already addressed this. We are sensitive to this. Medical tests, yes, important. Now, the online, I mean, physical confrontations, you know, we're talking about trade in arms, or comparisons rather, and the same for payment in cash. You have to have evidence, proof of transactions. So I don't know if we can say much more. We want an obligation to have insurance for the possession of these weapons. I think that's the very least one can expect. And I suspect you will agree. But once again, thank you and bravo for the work. And I suspect we will reach a compromise on this subject.
Grazie, onorevole Duran.
Thank you very much. Na FTD, Jaskiewicz, please.
Dziękuję, panie przewodniczący. Na wstępie też chciałbym o...
Thank you, President. First of all, I want to thank Ms. Ford and really pay tribute to her for all of the really intense and difficult work that she has taken on board. I just want to highlight that I agree with bringing it back to the month of July. I don't want to get into detail on this point. I am in favour of foreseeing the provision being applied for medical controls and the provision for online sales. As regards the A7 category, everything has been said already, so I'm not going to go into detail there, but I have a more general comment to make. I fear that when we focus on details, we kind of lose sight of the general interest of the public at large. We're talking a lot about terrorism and organised crime, etc. But we need to remember criminals and terrorists are not going to follow our work and provisions. I think, first of all, we need to ensure that these provisions are clear and easy to implement. In that way, we won't undermine some consumers, for example, as concerns sporting, shooting and hunters, people who are hunting. We shouldn't undermine their work. We need to really keep sight of the interest of citizens and consumers. We shouldn't be too focused on the dangers linked to terrorism and organised crime. Thank you.
Ecco, grazie onorevole Paskiewicz.
Thank you very much. Now for EMF, Mr. Trosinski, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, chers collègues.
Thank you, President, colleagues. Following the reading of the amendments, I think that we can see that very few of us want the adoption of this directive. Despite the serious work of our rapporteur on this document, we can see that we are going to have to look at some very controversial points. Members aren't here as intermediaries, they are here to bring the voice of the people. We need to call for the strict implementation of Directive 94, particularly as regards disactivation of firearms. There are no various options here. Either the existing directive is respected by all everywhere in the EU, or security imperatives and the bad implementation of the directive will mean the suspension of the Schengen area. Let's be serious and take the right and efficient decision. So rather than acting as intermediaries, I hope, and my group hopes, to see the withdrawal of this directive and to see a text from the Commission sent back to the Commission, because we're wasting time here. As regards the amendments of the rapporteur, I think Amendment 91 tabled by my group is important. We cannot look again at the classification of firearms, because when these are correctly applied, they don't cause any problems to police and security services. Legal holders of firearms will not be going against regulations in force. They should therefore not be subject of suspicion on our part or the Commission, and they should not have their freedoms undermined. We heard that weapons were dangerous, and that we were going to have to change things. That is why amendments that we have mentioned cancel any kind of change for the classification of firearms. Collectors of firearms should be excluded from this directive, as is stipulated in Directive 91. This would be impossible to implement, and French authorities have well understood this. That is the sense of our amendments. We are also calling for, with amendments 840 and 841, the withdrawal of the Directive 2015 related to firearms, which would transform collectors' weapons into something else. We need to favour the development of favouring the development of the black market with the new regulations is not your goal, and I'm convinced of that. Thank you.
Bene, grazie onorevole.
Thank you, Mrs. Trosinski. We have 6 speakers. We don't have a lot of time, so 7 now. So I propose 2 minutes per person, so that we can wind up at the on schedule at 12:30, and we will start with Mrs. Grappini, please.
Mulțumesc mult, domnule președinte.
Thank you, President. I'm not going to repeat what has been said by everyone. Certainly it's a very difficult report. Vicky did fantastic work. I would like to thank everyone. The number of amendments is huge. Certainly this is a very sensitive file. In Romania it caused a lot of debate. Aside from the amendments, however, personally I have 5 amendments that I feel are very important and relevant. In the Commission's proposal, I didn't see a clear clarification or specification as regards theft of arms, because arms can be stolen and then people can be killed with these. So who's responsible in case of the theft of firearms? I think that responsibility should be first and foremost to the owner. Now, the 5-year time frame for authorization is too long. I think 3 years would be perfect. I don't think we should keep the Commission's proposal as regards the age for minors who could obtain firearms or hunting weapons. I think we need to make a point there as regards sporting weapons. I don't see why a 16-year-old child should have a weapon that is destined for hunting. Now, finally, as regards medical exams, my group was not the only political group to say so. We feel that this should remain under the competence of member states. But if we cannot agree on the period during which these medical tests should take place, then we're going to have problems. If in some countries these tests are carried out every 5 years or every 15 years, we never know, this person might become mad in the meantime and kill people left, right and centre with their firearms. I think these are all very important.
Onorevole Fjellner.
Thank you very much. And first I'd like to thank Vicky for a very constructive and forward-looking work with this. But I've taken a little bit of a different approach. I have been very critical to the Commission's proposal and how the Commission has addressed this question. I understand that the Commission needed to show that they had to act after what happened this autumn, but sadly I think instead of getting at the real problem with illegal guns, all of the proposal hits the legal guns and something that won't affect the access of guns for terrorists or criminals at all. Both 5-year licenses, medical exams, hindering distance trade, and banning certain semi-automatics is example that won't stop terrorists but will hit hard at legal gun owners, law-abiding hunters and others. I asked the Commission already last time we met. First, how many crimes could be connected to legally owned possessed weapon? And I still haven't heard an example of that. I still haven't heard a figure. How big is the problem? I still haven't heard the Commission explain how big is the problem. And then after that, I also had asked the question, how many weapons? Because as Mr. Durant now there he is, pointed out, the definition is very dubious of semi-automatic weapons that reassemble. Then I asked the simplest of questions, how many weapons were affected by this legislation? How many are we banning? How big is the problem and how many is affected by our proposed solution? And I didn't get a response back in March, and I still haven't had a response to that. And drawing conclusions from that, the only thing I think that proves is that this is a rush job. If the Commission can't answer those 2 simple questions, I think the only reasonable approach we should take is to reject the proposal and ask the Commission to start in another direction, to address illegally possessed arms instead of taking this. Because if you can't describe the problem, explain who is affected by your solution, then you've actually missed the target by miles. Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole Fjellner.
Thank you, Mr. Fjellner. 2 minutes, I did say, please, ladies and gentlemen, because other people, if you don't, will be limited to 40 seconds or we'll have to finish late. Can I have Mr. Halla-aho, please?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. The large number of amendments is encouraging, as many of them address the most excessive and disproportionate details in the proposal. The rapporteur has also generally done a good job with her draft report. First of all, we should reject not only the proposed and unjustified ban on semi-automatic sporting rifles, that is subcategories A6 and A7, but also the proposed recategorization of legal firearms as a whole. This rejection has already been done by the LIBE Committee in its own opinion. Another important issue is the proposed total or nearly total ban on Category A firearms, which would lead to the destruction of valuable historical collections. These weapons are not used in crime and they are already strictly controlled. This ban was also rejected by the LIBE. Thirdly, we should reject the proposed mandatory medical checks and mandatory time limits for firearms licenses, as these would only increase bureaucracy and inconvenience without bringing any added value. These two were both rejected by the LIBE. Finally, I would like to express my support for the amendment number 1 to reject the Commission proposal as a whole. It violates all principles of good regulation. The Commission tried to take advantage of the tragic events in Paris last November to push through a largely ideological anti-firearm proposal. This has greatly damaged the image and credibility of the European Union. The attitude of the Commission in the committee hearings has been incredible. It is now up to the Parliament to try and undo that damage. We and our citizens deserve better lawmaking. Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole.
Thank you, Mr. Halla-aho. Mrs. Senlova, please. Olga.
Thank you for the floor. Together with my colleagues, I have presented a lot of amendments. Some of them have been referred to by my predecessors. In many questions, I support our rapporteur, that I would like to thank for her very pragmatic approach with respect to collectors, with respect to replicas, or with respect to disactivated arms. I have presented a lot of amendments reacting to the impact analysis that has been prepared by the Czech Republic. According to these analysis expertise, the amendments or the changes are contrary to our effort to reduce the number of illegally possessed arms. Recategorization of arms, in fact, would mean that a lot of legal arms would just be transferred to the area of illegally possessed arms, which is contrary to the declared purpose of this legislation. I welcome that a lot of colleagues, including the rapporteur, want to replace the category A7. And what is problematic to me as well is the proposal regarding automatic and semi-automatic conversion, and A6 category should include only those arms where the technical procedure has not been approved by the body of the member state, and if the arm has not been labeled like that. And I do not agree with the possibility to grant exceptions of illegally possessed arms, even if there is a legitimate reason for that. And to conclude, let me say that there are countries with quality, good legislation that is applied and enforced, and I would like us to build on this experience and to improve cooperation among member states, traceability and to focus only on illegal arms that are used by criminals and terrorists.
Thank you very much. Borson, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. This directive has raised lots of attention in member states, and I was contacted by many citizens, which their main concern was clear distinction between replicas and actual firearms, and I support that clear distinction. I come from a country which was 20 years ago in a war, so unfortunately I have lots of experience, and also during my professional life I did lots of examinations or checkups of people who held firearms, so I'm aware how important this obligatory examination is. So I proposed an amendment that such examination should be obligatory for traders and dealers too. Also, I have to say that I support an amendment on safe storage of weapons. Careless storage of weapons plus lack of medical examinations, this is a very dangerous combination. So I think that safety in that sense should be our main priority. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Virginie Rosier, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President, and thank you to the rapporteur. I agree with the position of our rapporteur. First of all, to clarify the legal conditions for holding firearms. These need to be clarified for sports people and people who are shooting. Now I'm thinking about the situation of collectors, and this should be not subject to any exception. I also agree with the will to improve traceability and interoperability of monitoring firearms when they're crossing our borders, and also the disactivation. As regards the amendments that were tabled, I want to state our opposition to amendments for the withdrawal of this. We feel the revision of this directive is necessary, and we want to see a broadening of the scope as regards some of the amendments that would be rejected. And we also, as regards extending the scope of online sales, as the rapporteur suggested, this should be strengthened. The same is true for minors. Now, I want to use the final seconds to make comments on some questions that my colleagues have mentioned as regards the review of this directive. For example, the control of firearms. In January 2015, during the attacks in Paris, one of the attackers used one of these weapons that was freely on sale on the market. Now, I want to talk about traceability also. In Toulouse in March 2012, Mamar Muram, the attacker, used a weapon that we know its traceability, and then at the same time in Jean, a weapon was used and similar weapons were all found in the person's home. I think the need for traceability is very clear, so I would invite all of my colleagues to support the revision of this directive to ensure that it is more balanced, and I'm sure the rapporteur is going to suggest that in the compromise amendments. Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole Rosier. L'ultimo intervento.
Thank you. My last speaker is Sulik, and then we will hear from the Commission, and then to conclude from the rapporteur.
Pod rúškom boja proti...
Thank you very much, Chairman. The European Commission, in the guise of combating terrorism, is trying to restrict people's personal freedoms. And then we ask ourselves why the EU is misunderstood by citizens. We won't solve the problem in this way. No terrorist is going to get a weapons permit and then go along to a normal dealer. I'm amazed to see the work the European Parliament is putting into this. Now that it's happened, I'd like to thank the rapporteur for her hard work and for having taken all this time to try to remove the greatest elements of nonsense from the proposal. But Ms. Bienkowska rather surprised me yesterday when she said that we don't need so many weapons. Surely citizens' freedoms should be more important than the Commission's opinion, but unfortunately that doesn't seem to be what's happening. I think for a long time this has been one of the mistakes of the Commission. The ladies and gentlemen sitting in the European Commission seem to act as if they were gods and could just tell ordinary citizens what they should and shouldn't do. I would subscribe to any amendment that acts as an impediment to this directive. In fact, I would be happiest really if the entire directive were to be withdrawn. Of the 800 odd amendments that have been tabled, around 30 are from myself, tabled by myself and my colleagues, and I would urge you to support our amendments. Thank you.
Diamo la parola alla...
Well, thank you. I'd now like to give the floor to the European Commission, so Hubert. I hope I've got your name right.
Yes, thank you, President. It was almost right. Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank you for Mrs. Ford for her draft report, constructive draft report, which the Commission welcomes very much. Again, from the outset, let me just make a few remarks. The Commission, with its proposal, never made an amalgam, and it keeps being repeated, never made an amalgam between law-abiding citizens that have rights and are authorized to hold firearms, such as sport shooters and hunters, and terrorists. We never did that. We never had the intention to do so, and we never will do that. We are very conscious that there are, as I said, millions of law-abiding citizens that own arms and firearms in a responsible way, and we did not, with our proposal, want to make their lives difficult or miserable. However, as foreseen in the directive, we did a very thorough evaluation of the implementation of the directive, of all its provisions, how they work, and what difficulties stakeholders, including member states, associations, manufacturing industry, saw and encountered with the directive as it stands today. We undertook 3 evaluation and studies looking into the impacts also on particular provisions of the directive, and the whole process took about 1.5 years with, I said, intense consultation and discussion and wide consultation and discussion with stakeholders, including many of the major European associations of firearms holders, be that sport shooting associations, hunting associations, etc., including also industry, to be sure that we get a feeling back and a view back from industry on the impact of some of the measures proposed. So we did consult, we did listen before we put our proposals forward. One more thing. Did our proposal go in the wrong direction? No. What we proposed was looking or trying to react to weaknesses and loopholes that our evaluation had shown in the directive itself, where we wanted to ensure that from the illicit market of firearms, weapons could divert into the illegal sphere, if you so wish, ultimately offering possibilities for criminals, whatever way, be they terrorists or not, to benefit or profit from such weaknesses and loopholes. And this was the motivation for the Commission to put forward its proposals. And as we heard earlier on, there were cases, unfortunately, very unfortunate cases, where firearms totally put on the illicit market were used also in recent terrorist attacks in Paris. And I'm not going to repeat that. You have heard that earlier on. Just 2 more issues. On the categories, we have said from the beginning that we are very conscious and made that very clear that, yes, resemblance is not a good criteria, and we were very happy to see that there are lots of good proposals, interesting proposals being put forward, and we fully agree with that, defining criteria to better describe what we don't want to see as weapons, dangerous weapons in the future on the illicit market anymore is better described in form of criteria. And as I said, there are lots of very constructive, interesting proposals, and the Commission is very open to that proposals. Again, the motivation is not to make the life of sport shooters and hunters difficult. We fully understand there are semi-automatic weapons used by both professions or sport shooters in many cases, and we need to make sure that their rights and their either the right to exercise their profession or their hobby is not hampered by these proposals, but there are ways of doing it, and we see again that there are very constructive proposals on the table. On collectors, the Commission proposed to include collectors in its proposal in the law, in the directive, which so far have not been included at all, meaning there has been absolutely no rule whatsoever on collectors, which in our view are to an extent nevertheless firearms holders and others, and should be included in the directive.
Abbiamo poco tempo.
I beg your pardon, we have a time problem. Now I'm taking comments on amendments. Sorry, we don't have much time, and we're at the stage of commenting on the amendments. So if you could be brief, because we've already discussed the general issues, and indeed we will discuss them again later. But if you could conclude now?
I can conclude now, Chair. It's perfectly fine for me. Thank you very much.
Grazie. La parola.
Thank you very much. Rapporteur, please.
Focus on some of the comments that have been about the amendments. Thank you. First of all, on the amendment to reject the Commission proposal, as colleagues know, I also tabled this amendment. I do not think that it is the right approach because there are some very specific issues that need to be addressed. And in my view, as I wrote in my original report, one of the very specific issues to be addressed is the status of firearms that have been converted to firing blanks. And then those firearms which were then reconverted very easily back into live firearms because they had not been properly deactivated and were used in the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and similar firearms have turned up in my own member state. This is clearly a loophole which needs to be addressed. And the suggestion that is not a loophole, not a concern, and we can work with the existing law, I think is incorrect. And I would like to close this very specific loophole. There's another issue that I think needs to be addressed, which is the fact that the deactivation regulation, which was rushed through, has got some very serious problems with it. It's actually made deactivation worse in certain member states because you can't recognise historic deactivations, and you can't re-deactivate a deactivated firearm if it's been irreversibly changed. Just quickly on some of the points that have been made. EPP, thank you very much for your suggestion on the compromise on marking, that we should put in the words if feasible. That if feasible, I will suggest that we put that into the appropriate article, not just the recital. And on the whole, I agree with most of the other EPP points. On the socialist point, to try and make one category for museums and one category for collectors, I've tried that, but it's very difficult to work out where the two end up being different. There are some museums that feel more like collectors and some that don't. As a result, I've tightened up the language that covers both of them, to use the language persons that are involved in, etc. And thank you for the colleagues who've made suggestions on that. On the issue of A6s, I agree with the Czech response here. That I think that's a good suggestion, that it should be semi-automatics that have been converted in a way that could be reversible to automatics. Maybe they should stay in category A6. But if it was an irreversible operation, and incidentally, I was very concerned with a meeting that I had with a senior officer of Europol who told me that if we take away those firearms that are in relatively common use in the Czech Republic and other similar member states, his concern is that they will go undercover, become unlicensed, people won't give them up, and security will be worse. And so I am minded to vote for that type of definition on A6. Pascal and the Greens, you gave some interesting suggestions on storage, suggesting that ammunition should be kept separate from other firearms. I'd like to understand from some of the members who are more expert here what they think about those suggestions on storage, specific requirements, because I'm not an expert on that issue, so I'd like other members to look at that. And your amendment on insurance, I'd like to have feedback from others on that particular one too. And I do think that we will be able to find a good way forward. I don't want the delay in this to cause concern for people outside the room. I want to take time to get this right, and I respect, or as good as possible, going into trialogue, and I respect completely what members have said. The first suggestion from the Commission would have had many unintended consequences without necessarily addressing the very specific issues that are there with the existing legislation. Thank you to the colleagues who are trying to make this better and more workable, respecting legal owners, but also closing the existing loopholes. Thank you.